G'day everybody, welcome back to the channel. As the title of this video alluded, I'm going to chat to you today about my switch away from Fujifilm. I've been using Fujifilm for the last 10 years and now I feel it's time to switch. But before I go further into that, I wanted to give you a little bit of a history lesson into the cameras I've been using since I started in photography. Now, I took up photography when I was about 16 years old. My father was a very keen amateur photographer and he really enjoyed shooting landscapes and wildlife. And that's what I was interested in at first as well. My very first camera was this guy here, the Praktica MTL5, and it was actually a really good camera to learn on. Obviously, fully manual film camera, and I used to shoot a lot of slide transparency film, so you had to really nail your exposure. So I learned a lot of valuable lessons in how to expose for film with very low dynamic range. So this was well before autofocus, so manual focus skills were also learnt very early on. And I had a number of M42 mount lenses to go with this camera, ranging from sort of wide angle right through to a 500mm f8 telephoto lens. When I finished high school, I was very interested in pursuing photography as a career, so I applied to attend the Queensland College of Art and managed to get in, and I studied an associate diploma of photography for 2.5 years. So in those early months at art college, I quickly knew that I had to upgrade my camera, and the brand of choice back then was Nikon. So my very first Nikon was a Nikon FA. Absolutely loved this camera. Again, fully manual focus, but we now had some automatic exposure modes, and the FA was one of the first cameras to introduce matrix metering. So over the years I owned a number of Nikon film cameras, including the F90X, the F4S, and eventually the F100, which I still own today. Now the F100 really did sort of pave the way for the more modern DSLR style, with some very similar switches and buttons that you'll see on a DSLR and even on some of the modern Z series cameras of today. So when digital first started to become popular in the early 2000s, I naturally started using Nikon DSLRs. I got to use some of the very first Nikon digital SLRs, like the D1 series. But the first cameras that I bought were the D2H and the D2X. It was around the time with the D2H and the D2X that Canon started really making inroads with their 1D series cameras, and their high ISO performance was a lot better than Nikon at the time. I did have the opportunity to use some Canon cameras, and for a while I considered switching. But then Nikon released their first full frame camera, being the Nikon D3 in 2007. Its high ISO performance was much improved compared to the previous APS-C D2H and D2X, which quickly put a stop to any thought of switching away from Nikon. So I then used the D3, D3S, and eventually the D4 for quite a while. And as second bodies, I also had the D700 and then the D750. Then around 2014, Fuji started to really make some strides with their digital mirrorless cameras. And I really saw the advantages of mirrorless at that time, and I wanted to move away from DSLR. So I bought a Fujifilm X-T1 and a few prime lenses, the 23mm 1.4, 35 1.4 and the 56 1.2. Initially my thoughts were this will be a great little travel walk around kit. It's really small and lightweight, but I absolutely loved shooting with the Fujis, and I loved the manual controls, which reminded me of the old Nikon film cameras. So while I love shooting with the Fuji X-T1, I really couldn't rely on it for the professional work, so I still had my Nikon D4 and Pro Series lenses. Then Fuji released the X-T2, which improved autofocus quite a lot, had a higher resolution, so I got rid of the X-T1s and bought two X-T2s, and I started using the Fujis for more and more of my professional portrait work. Gradually, I started adding more lenses to the kit, and I started using the Nikon gear less and less. So in 2015, I decided to make the full switch away from Nikon, and I sold my D4 and Pro Series lenses and just started using the Fuji X-T2. I did, however, hang on to the Nikon D750, and I had 35 f2 50-1.4 and 85 1.4 D series lenses, which I still kept to use with that camera. I also kept quite a few manual focus Nikon AI and AIS lenses, which I loved to adapt to the Fuji bodies. So for around the last 18 months or so, my Fuji lineup has been the X-T4, X-H2S and X-H2. And primarily my X-H2 obviously has been my main stills body for my professional work, X-H2S video, and the X-T4 has just been my sort of backup camera, which I occasionally use for video and also just as my walkabout camera. I know there's been a lot of chat on the internet lately about the poor autofocus performance in video, specifically continuous autofocus on the X-H2S, and how recent firmware updates have made the cameras perform even worse than they originally did. Now that's not something that I have had an issue with because I generally don't use the camera in that particular way. A lot of the video work I do is filming stage performances where I'm locking the camera into manual focus. I don't really have any complaints about the XH series cameras, and for the most part there's been no real deficiencies in these cameras. They work really, really well. So what are the main reasons I'm looking to switch away from Fuji after 10 years and going back to Nikon? Well, when I first switched to Fuji, Nikon looked to be years and years away from producing good quality mirrorless cameras, and that proved to be true. It's only in the last sort of 12-18 months that I feel like they've really caught up with the rest of the brands, and their mirrorless options are really, really good. Future Cam here. I was just editing the video and I just thought I'd clarify a little bit about what I just stated about the early Nikon Z cameras, the Z6 and the Z7. When I mentioned that they really weren't up to par with competitors of the time, it was really just about the autofocus. Image quality was absolutely outstanding in both those models, especially the Z7. That 45 megapixel sensor is absolutely outstanding. And the Z7 is still a preferred camera by a lot of landscape photographers because of that sensor quality. So with autofocus, when the Z6 and Z7 were released, it was really the face detect and eye detect focus that was lacking. Now they were subsequently improved by no end with firmware updates over the following years, and I think it was firmware 3.0, which was about 18 months after launch, that they really improved a hell of a lot. Another thing that Nikon was heavily criticized for was the single card slot. Now I think that was probably a little bit unfair, as Canon were also releasing their mirrorless cameras around the same time, and they only had a single card slot as well. The difference being the Canon cameras had SD slots, and the Z6 and Z7 both had XQD or CF Express Type B cards. Now I know a lot of photographers that prefer 2 card slots for redundancy, but I'm yet to find anybody that's had a CF Express Type B card fail. I certainly haven't over the years that I've been shooting with them, and none of the photographers that I personally know have had any issues either. So that's all I really wanted to mention, so let's go back to the original video. After 10 years of the one brand, I'm now feeling like I may need a little bit of a change just to spark some inspiration again. I am feeling the urge to go back to full frame away from APS-C. And one of the reasons for that is that I do still love using my old manual lenses and adapting them to mirrorless. And while I can do that with the Fuji cameras, I'm not making use of the full potential of those lenses because of the crop factor involved with APS-C. I've got some lovely manual focus glass from 20mm up to 135mm, and I want to make use of the full image circle. So we all know there are some situations where APS-C sensors don't perform quite as well as full frame. That really hasn't been so much of a hindrance to me, and I've learned to work around those situations. And I've always been really quite happy with the performance and the image quality out of these cameras. So over the last couple of weeks, I've actually had the distinct pleasure of playing with some of the current Nikon mirrorless cameras. I do still have a pretty good relationship with Nikon Australia, and they were kind enough to lend me some bodies. So the first camera that obviously created my interest was the ZF. ZF in styling is very reminiscent of the Fuji X-T series, and of course the original Nikon film bodies. And that was one of the things that attracted me to Fuji in the first place. I do love manual controls and dials. So I took this camera camping, and along with a number of my Nikon lenses, and I shot some amazing results. Another one of my favorite lenses that I own is the Voigtlander 58mm Nocton, the f1.4. Using that lens with an FTZ adapter on this camera does allow you to get manual focus confirmation, and it works really, really well. And the rendering from that lens is absolutely gorgeous. I was super happy with all the results from the different manual focus lenses that I used with this camera. Colors are really beautiful, and high ISO performance is also really good. So that started getting me really thinking hard about making a full switch. So along with the ZF, I've also been playing around with the Z8 and the Z6 III. So if we do a comparison between my Fuji kit, being the X-T4, would easily be replaced beautifully with the ZF. The XH2S replaced with the Z6 III, and of course the higher megapixel XH2 replaced with the Nikon Z8. Now, after playing with these cameras, I've actually fallen in love with Nikon again. Not that I fell out of love with them, but I'm super, super impressed with the quality I'm getting out of these cameras. I've only had the Z6 III for a little over a week, and I've used it for video on a couple of jobs, and it performed really, really well. And the Z8 I've had for a couple of weeks longer, and I've also used it on quite a few jobs for stills. Now, due to the nature of a lot of my professional work shooting performers on stage, I'm shooting at higher ISOs, and the Z8 is unbelievable compared to the XH2. The sharpness and detail at equivalent ISOs is incomparable really. So currently I'm looking at offloading all my Fuji gear. I've already gotten rid of the X-T4, which is why you haven't seen it here today, along with a few of the lenses. And I've already purchased the Z6 III, and we'll be getting the Z8 as well very, very shortly. And down the line, I will also get the ZF. But that is not a priority at the moment. These two cameras are going to cover all the work that I do without any issues. And the ZF will make an excellent backup camera and walk around camera for adapting all my old lenses. So along with the Fuji X mount cameras, I have also recently picked up a GFX 50S Mark II. So this was offered to me at a really good deal and I couldn't pass it up. I've always loved the idea of the GFX medium format cameras, and I have used the 50 and the 100 before, but never really thought about purchasing one for myself just because of the cost involved. So currently the only autofocus lens I have for this camera is the 32-64, which is an excellent lens. Autofocus speed is average, like all the GFX lenses on this body. To get really good autofocus, you do have to go to the newer 100 Mark II or 100S Mark II, and the autofocus is a lot better. So along with the 32-64, I've actually purchased some used Pentax 645 glass. So I've got the 45, 75, 150 and 200 mm lenses. Now those are obviously manual focus lenses and they work extremely well on this camera. Being medium format glass, they obviously have the image circle that more than covers the GFX. So there's no issues with edge-to-edge sharpness, and they do perform really well and they render quite beautifully. I've also been using some of my Nikon glass, particularly the 105 f2.5 AI lens, which is one of my all-time favorite Nikon pieces of glass. And that renders beautifully on this camera. So while it does vignette a little and soften in the corners, in the center it is really sharp, even wide open. I've also even used the Voigtlander 58mm Nocton, and it vignettes a little bit more heavily, but cropped in a little to get rid of that. It's absolutely stunning on this camera. So my dilemma with the GFX is basically it's just limiting to the styles of photography that I can do with it. And it's quite a bit of money tied up in that body, which I could potentially use to purchase some Z series glass. I'm not planning on getting rid of it just yet, but it is certainly something that I'm considering. And I really want to do some more testing between the GFX 50 and the Nikon Z8. We've only got 5 megapixels worth of difference there, 45 versus 50. So I don't expect that to be much of a change. Dynamic range also may have a slight edge with the Fuji, but again, for the style of photography that I'm doing, would I ever notice it? Probably not. So the plan is to do quite a bit more testing with these cameras. I'm going to shoot some more landscape and obviously some more portraits and do some side-by-side comparisons, even with the same lenses adapted to both cameras. So obviously this is not going to be a cheap exercise switching from Fuji to Nikon Z, especially when I'm looking at the Z8 and the Z6 III. So lenses are gonna be a little bit of a struggle initially. So my main priority at the moment is just figuring out which lenses I need to cover the jobs that I do shoot on a regular basis. And then when I can afford it, just fill in those gaps. So one of my regular gigs is filming and shooting stills for some of the burlesque shows here in Brisbane. And for one in particular, I shoot stills and video at the same time. So with the Fuji kit, I was often using the X-T4 as a static video camera. And then for stills, I would use the XH2 with the 16-55 2.8 and the XH2S with the 50-140 2.8. Because in these shows, there is a mix of big group routines and then solo performers. So for the group routines, I would use the XH2 with the wider zoom, and the solo routines with the XH2S with the longer zoom. This allowed me to get a really good coverage of the entire stage and be able to zoom in on the individual performers. So one of the things I really wanted to test with the Nikon system, with the Z8 in particular, was whether I could shoot the entire show just with one body. Now to do that, I would need a slightly longer zoom than what a 24-70 would allow. So the two that I chose to test was the 24-120 Nikon S lens, the f4, and the Tamron 35-150 f2 to 2.8. So on a recent burlesque show job, I did half with the 24-120 and half with the Tamron 35-150. The 35-150 is a fabulous lens, but it's quite heavy. Obviously it's a bigger range and a faster aperture, so you can see the difference in the size there, and there's a considerable difference in weight. But of course, a lot of people use the Tamron as a replacement for a 24-70 and a 70-200. So you get, I guess, the best of the range. You don't get the absolute wide end and you don't get the absolute telephoto end. But even though neither of these lenses give me the reach of a 200, my thinking was that I could easily switch to DX crop mode on the Z8 and still get 19 megapixels, which is more than enough than what I need to produce for these shows. And that would definitely cover me from the wide angle for the group shots through the telephoto for the solo performers. So in the past, typically with the Fujis, I would shoot at around f4, f4.5 and around 6400 ISO. So I shot both these lenses at f4 and I was super impressed with the quality out of the 24-120. Shooting wide open, the images are super sharp and detailed. And I actually think the autofocus hit rate was a little bit better with the 24-120 than it was with the Tamron 35-150. Now this is a fantastic lens and it is super sharp, but I didn't see any real benefit in sharpness or autofocus over the 24-120. So I probably would have purchased the 24-120 as a general purpose lens anyway. So for walking about, landscape, that sort of stuff, that would have been in my bag anyway. So to not have to buy the 35-150 Tamron, knowing that I can shoot burlesque shows and other stage shows with the 24-120 is fantastic, and even making the switch over from Fuji a little bit easier, knowing that I don't have to drop another $2,500–3,000 on this lens. So the two lenses that I'm looking at getting initially for the Nikon Z series are the 24-120 f4S and the 70-200 2.8S. Now those two lenses can pretty much cover all the jobs that I shoot on a regular basis. And the other great thing about Nikon Z mount at the moment is the number of third-party manufacturers releasing really cheap, good quality lenses. So I'm going to be looking at supplementing those two Nikon zooms with some primes from 7 Artisans and Viltrox. I've already done some shoots with the 7 Artisans 50mm 1.8 and I've been super impressed with the image quality. Sharpness is really, really good. Autofocus performance is also very good. While it may not quite stack up to the Nikon 50mm 1.8S, it's not far behind. By the way, in case you're wondering, I'm filming myself with a Nikon Z9. One of my very good friends, Paul, who attends a lot of my workshops, is currently overseas for 6 weeks, and he is a Nikon Z shooter and has a lot of gear, but he's only taking a small amount of gear with him overseas. So he's kindly left his Z9 and a number of lenses with me to play with. So the one lens that I've been really loving is the 180 to 600, and I've been getting out and shooting some birds with that and the Z8, and I'm honestly just blown away with the bird tracking autofocus. It's been a very long time since I've shot nature with a long lens like that, and this camera and that lens as a combo makes it very, very easy getting back to shooting wildlife again. So I am planning to produce some more videos on my switch over to Nikon Z, and of course around the lenses that I choose to use with these cameras. Now bear in mind, I am a working professional photographer. That is my full-time job. YouTube is just something that I do when I get the chance and when I feel I have something to share with you. So those videos will come out in due course. So thanks very much for watching and listening to my little chat about my switch over from Fuji X to Z mount. If any of you are also considering the switch or are already using a Nikon Z series, make a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, ciao for now.